Hello everyone, Dark of All Trades here. Now before I go into the video today, I have a very brief preface. I'm going to be referencing a lot of scholars on this. It's a very complicated and nuanced topic that I have a pretty strong stance on, but even I don't have a complete understanding of. So if you don't know everything I'm talking about today, don't feel too bad. But I will do my absolute best to keep things as simple as I can. Now on to the video. Today, I'd like to take a look at a practice so normalized in our society that we rarely question its ethical foundations: the religious indoctrination, specifically of children. When I speak of religious indoctrination, I'm referring to the systematic process of instilling religious beliefs, doctrines, and practices in children before they've developed the cognitive abilities to critically evaluate these claims. According to developmental psychologists like Jean Paget and more recent researchers like Paul Bloom of Yale University, children under the age of 7 typically lack the cognitive tools for abstract reasoning and critical evaluation necessary to assess metaphysical claims. Here I need to distinguish between teaching about religion and religious indoctrination. Teaching involves presenting information from multiple perspectives, encouraging questions, and fostering critical thinking. A teacher might explain, "Throughout history, humans have developed various belief systems to understand existence. Some believe in one god, some believe in many gods, and some in no gods at all. Here's what different traditions propose and why." This approach respects a child's developing autonomy. Indoctrination, conversely, presents a single worldview as unquestionable truth. Our religion is the one true faith. Doubting is sinful and leads to eternal punishment. That's indoctrination. As philosopher Stephen Law notes in his work on intellectual black holes, such approaches create self-sealing belief systems resistant to outside evidence or questioning. Many religious parents and educators would object here, arguing they're simply passing down their traditions and values, just as they would teach moral principles or cultural practices. This is a fair point to consider. However, the critical difference lies in how these beliefs are presented, as open to question and revision or as unchallengeable truths backed by divine authority and eternal consequences. The core ethical question before us is this: is it morally justified to impose comprehensive worldviews on children before they possess the cognitive capacity to evaluate them? When we label a 4-year-old as a Christian child or a Muslim child, we're not describing the child's considered philosophical position. We're describing a form of intellectual conscription that they never consented to. As evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins observes in The God Delusion, there is no such thing as a Christian child or a Muslim child. There are only children of Christian parents or Muslim parents. We would find it peculiar to speak of a Marxist child or a libertarian child, yet we unquestioningly accept religious labels for those too young to have formed their own views. A 2014 study by Korevu, Chen, and Harris, published in Cognitive Science, found that children struggle to distinguish between fantastical fiction and religious narratives, suggesting they lack the cognitive tools to critically evaluate supernatural claims. This cognitive vulnerability makes children particularly susceptible to accepting whatever worldview is presented with authority and repetition. As I look into this further, this practice exploits children's developmental limitations and violates their future intellectual autonomy in ways that can lead to lasting psychological and intellectual consequences. Our society must begin to recognize religious indoctrination for what it is: not simply a parental right or a cultural tradition, but an ethical problem that warrants serious examination. Let's now examine what makes children particularly vulnerable to religious indoctrination: their cognitive development and the way their young minds process information about the world. Developmental psychology provides compelling evidence for children's extraordinary susceptibility to authoritative claims. Dr. Paul Bloom of Yale University, in his influential work Descartes' Baby, demonstrates that children exhibit what psychologists call credulous trust. They accept what adults tell them, especially their parents, with minimal skepticism. This makes sense. They have to do this to survive. In a 2020 study published in Developmental Science, Korevu and Harris found that preschoolers accepted information from adult authority figures even when it contradicted their own first-hand observations. Like I said, this trust evolved for a good reason. Throughout human history, children who quickly absorbed their parents' warnings about environmental dangers were more likely to survive. However, this adaptive trait becomes problematic when applied to religious claims that cannot be empirically verified or tested. Research in cognitive science reveals that children aren't just passive recipients of religious ideas. They're actually predisposed towards supernatural thinking. Dr. Justin Baird's work, detailed in Why Would Anyone Believe in God, identifies what he calls a hyperactive agency detection device in human cognition. We're naturally wired to detect intentional agents and purpose, even where none exist. When a branch breaks in the forest, our first instinct is to assume someone or something caused it, rather than attributing it to natural forces. This cognitive bias made our ancestors safer from predators, but makes children particularly receptive to religious narratives involving supernatural beings. Dr. Deborah Kellerman's research at Boston University demonstrates what she terms promiscuous teleology in children, the tendency to assume everything exists for a purpose. When asked, "Why are rocks pointy?" young children typically answer, "So animals can scratch themselves," rather than explaining geological processes. This purpose-driven thinking creates fertile ground for religious explanations that assert divine intention behind natural phenomena. To be fair, some religious educators do attempt to foster critical thinking within faith traditions. Progressive religious education sometimes encourages questioning and exploration. However, research by Altemeyer and Hunsberger, published in the International Journal for the Psychology of Religion, found that religious fundamentalism strongly correlates with authoritarian parenting styles that discourage questioning of religious doctrines. The fundamental ethical problem emerges when religious doctrines are presented as absolute, unquestionable truth during this cognitively vulnerable period. Consider a revealing comparison: Santa Claus versus God. Both involve invisible beings who reward good behavior, yet society treats these beliefs very differently as children mature. A 2016 study by Woolley and Gassani in cognitive development found that by age 7 to 8, most children have developed skepticism about Santa, often with parental encouragement as a sign of maturation. The belief in God, however, is reinforced through community, ritual, and emotional experiences. Children who question God are often discouraged from doing so, or even warned of spiritual consequences, while questioning Santa is seen as a natural developmental milestone. Neuroscience adds a little bit of context to this discussion. Dr. Sarah Jane Blakemore's research at University College London shows that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for critical thinking and evaluation of abstract concepts, continues developing well into the early 20s. Children, and even adolescents, simply lack the fully developed neural architecture necessary for sophisticated evaluation of metaphysical claims. Consider how we approach other complex domains with children. We don't expect 8-year-olds to evaluate economic theories or understand constitutional law. We recognize that they need to develop foundational knowledge and reasoning skills first. Yet somehow, when it comes to ultimate questions about existence, purpose, and metaphysical reality, many religious traditions expect children not just to engage with these concepts, but to commit to specific answers before they've developed the capacity for abstract reasoning. Some might argue that all education involves teaching children concepts before they can fully understand them. This is true, but most educational domains build in progressive complexity and encourage questions as understanding develops. Traditional religious education often does the opposite, demanding stronger commitment and discouraging deeper questioning as children age. This cognitive vulnerability of children isn't just an interesting scientific observation, it forms the basis of a serious ethical concern. When we indoctrinate children religiously before they can critically evaluate these claims, we're not respecting them as developing rational beings. We're exploiting their developmental limitations to instill beliefs they cannot meaningfully consent to or evaluate. Having established children's cognitive vulnerability, we now need to confront a central ethical problem of religious doctrination: the complete absence of informed consent. Children cannot meaningfully consent to religious belief systems. This fundamental fact deserves serious ethical consideration. In most significant domains of human life, we recognize that consent matters profoundly, especially for decisions with far-reaching consequences. Yet when it comes to imposing comprehensive worldviews on children, this principle is frequently disregarded. Consider how we approach other areas where consent is considered essential. We don't expect a 7-year-old to have an informed stance on economic policy. As philosopher Stephen Law points out in his work, The War for Children's Minds, we would find it strange to describe a child as a neo-Keynesian economist or a libertarian. We understand that children lack the knowledge, experience, and cognitive development to evaluate complex economic systems. Yet somehow we may find it perfectly acceptable to declare, "My child is a Christian," or "My child is a Muslim," as if a child could possibly have reached an informed position on complex theological claims. The contradiction becomes clear when we examine medical ethics. Dr. Priscilla Alderson's research on children's consent in healthcare, published in the journals Social Science and Medicine, demonstrates that we don't allow young children to make major medical decisions independently. We recognize that they lack the capacity to weigh risks, benefits, and alternatives. In most jurisdictions, even adolescents cannot consent to certain medical procedures without parental involvement. We understand that meaningful consent requires cognitive maturity and information access. Yet, when it comes to religious commitment, which can shape one's entire worldview, moral framework, and identity, the principle of consent is frequently overlooked. This inconsistency reveals something profound about how religious indoctrination has been normalized. Like I said before, Richard Dawkins highlights this in The God Delusion, where he observes how freely we apply religious labels to children. These labels don't describe a child's considered position. They describe the beliefs adults have imposed on them. Though to be fair, various religious traditions approach children's religious education differently. A 2018 study by Pew Research Center found significant variation in how strictly children are socialized into religious beliefs, with some progressive congregations encouraging questioning and exploration. However, the same study found that among more conservative religious groups, questioning foundational beliefs was often actively discouraged or treated as spiritually dangerous. Consider this thought experiment proposed by philosopher Peter Cave. Would we find it ethical for a child to be raised in a rigid political ideology with no exposure to alternatives? Imagine a child being taught from birth that one political party is absolutely correct and the others are evil, and questioning the party's platform is morally wrong and leads to terrible consequences. Most people across the political spectrum would consider this indoctrination troubling. Yet substitute religion for political party, and suddenly many defend the practice as a parental right or a cultural tradition. The problem of consent extends beyond just the initial imposition of beliefs. Dr. Marlene Winnell, a psychologist specializing in religious trauma and the author of Leaving the Fold, has documented how many religious traditions include powerful mechanisms to prevent questioning once indoctrination has occurred. Concepts like eternal damnation for unbelief, community shunning for doubters, or the equation of questioning with sin create significant psychological barriers to critically examining received beliefs later in life. While Marlene Winnell's work on religious trauma syndrome is important, I need to be clear and say that RTS is not yet an officially recognized psychological diagnosis in the DSM. While many psychologists acknowledge it as a real phenomenon, as of writing the script, RTS is still under discussion within the mental health community. A 2020 study by Hookway and Habibus, published in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, found that even among adults who left their childhood religions, many experienced severe psychological distress due to ingrained fears of divine punishment or moral condemnation, years or even decades after intellectually rejecting those beliefs. This demonstrates how early religious indoctrination can constrain autonomous choice well into adulthood. Some argue that parents have the right to raise their children according to their values. This is valid to an extent, but as legal scholar James Dwyer demonstrates in Religious Schools versus Children Rights, parental rights cannot be absolute when they potentially constrain a child's development or future autonomy. We don't permit parents to deny children education or necessary medical care, even on religious grounds, because these actions violate what is sometimes called a child's right to an open future. Religious indoctrination similarly constrains a child's intellectual and spiritual autonomy. One might contend that children will eventually be able to make their own choices as adults, but this ignores the powerful psychological conditioning that early religious training creates. Dr. Valerie Tarico, a psychologist who studies religious belief formation, explains that by the time a person reaches intellectual maturity, religious beliefs have often been deeply internalized through years of repetition, emotional experiences, and social reinforcement. The neuroscience of belief formation, particularly research on neuroplasticity by Dr. Bruce Perry, shows that belief systems instilled during critical development periods create neural pathways that are difficult, though not impossible, to reconfigure later in life. To be clear, many people do successfully deconvert, suggesting that religious belief is deeply ingrained, but not necessarily irreversible. The ethical principle here is straightforward. Individuals should not have comprehensive worldviews imposed on them before they develop the cognitive capacity to evaluate them. If religious claims are true, they should withstand scrutiny by mature minds. If faith traditions have merit, they should be able to attract adherents who come to them through free inquiry, not through childhood conditioning, fear, or social pressure. Having established the cognitive vulnerability of children and the consent problems inherent in religious indoctrination, let me now examine the potentially harmful consequences that can result from this practice. While not all religious education produces these outcomes equally, research identifies three significant areas of concern. The first major harm is the impediment to intellectual development through the suppression of critical inquiry. Many religious traditions explicitly value faith over skepticism, with some defining faith precisely as belief without evidence. Darnell and Shurkat examined the writings of popular conservative Protestant authors to ascertain if they actually do preach against higher education. They found that conservative ministers do in fact oppose secular education because it threatens religious beliefs such as the belief that the Bible is inerrant. Consider how many religious texts include warnings against doubt. The Bible states in James 1:6 that the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. Many interpretations of Islam consider apostasy, that is leaving the faith, a serious transgression. Dr. Valerie Tarico's research on cognitive boundary maintenance in religious groups demonstrates how these teachings create powerful psychological barriers to critically examining received beliefs. The impact on intellectual development is measurable. A 2019 study by Anderson and Hill in Science Education found that students from strictly religious educational backgrounds showed greater difficulty applying critical thinking skills to topics where religious beliefs and scientific evidence appeared to conflict. The testimonies of ex-believers provide compelling evidence of this harm. Dr. Marlene Winnell, who coined the term religious trauma syndrome, has documented hundreds of cases where former believers describe the intellectual paralysis they experienced when first questioning their indoctrinated beliefs. A former evangelical described to Winnell, quote, "I knew how to analyze literature, evaluate historical claims, and apply scientific thinking in my college classes, but for years I couldn't apply those same skills to my religious beliefs because the fear was too overwhelming," end quote. It's important to acknowledge that more progressive and liberal religious traditions often do encourage questioning and intellectual exploration. A 2020 comparative study by Payden in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion found significant differences in critical thinking outcomes between children raised in fundamentalist versus progressive religious environments. However, the study still found that any religious education emphasizing certainty about metaphysical claims showed some negative correlation with certain aspects of critical thinking development. Perhaps the most troubling potential harm involves psychological damage from fear-based doctrines. Consider the doctrine of hell, the belief that non-believers will suffer eternal conscious torment. Dr. Marlene Winnell's clinical work with former believers documents that when children are taught they or loved ones might suffer forever in hell, it can create profound anxiety and psychological distress. Dr. John D. Ramirez's study, The Fear of Hell in Childhood, examined 450 adults who had been taught about hell as children. His research showed that 62% reported experiencing nightmares about hell during childhood, 53% reported persistent anxiety about salvation status, and 31% exhibited symptoms consistent with religious trauma even decades later. A particularly striking finding was that the severity of these symptoms correlated strongly with the age at which hell doctrines were introduced. The younger the child, the more severe the long-term psychological impact. Beyond hell doctrine, many high-control religious groups impose harmful shame around normal human experiences. Dr. Tina Shermer Sellers, in her book Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, documents how purity culture often saddles young people with crushing shame around sexuality. Her clinical research found that religious sexual shame correlates with higher rates of sexual dysfunction, relationship difficulties, and depression in adulthood. LGBTQIA+ individuals raised in non-affirming religious environments face particular risks. A 2018 study by Ryan and colleagues, published in the Journal of Homosexuality, found that LGBTQIA+ young people from rejecting religious backgrounds had a 300% increased risk of suicide attempts compared to those from accepting backgrounds. Religious trauma researcher Dr. Daryl Ray has documented through his Religious Trauma Institute that many ex-believers exhibit symptoms similar to complex PTSD, including flashbacks, severe anxiety, depression, cognitive difficulties, and problems with self-worth and identity formation. As I mentioned before, while religious trauma syndrome is not yet included in the diagnostic manuals, the American Psychological Association has begun recognizing religious trauma as a legitimate area of clinical concern. It bears emphasizing that not all religious environments produce these harms equally. A 2021 study by Williams in Mental Health, Religion, and Culture found that affirming non-authoritarian religious environments showed no increased risk for psychological distress. The key factors correlating with harm were emphasis on divine punishment, discouragement of questioning, and teachings that pathologized normal human experiences or identities. The third area of concern involves how fear-based religious instruction may impact moral development. Developmental psychologist Lawrence Kohlsberg's seminal work on moral reasoning identified 6 stages of moral development, from punishment avoidance to universal ethical principles. His research found that individuals who base their morality primarily on religious authority often remained at lower stages of moral development compared to those who developed autonomous moral reasoning. This theoretical framework has received empirical support. A 2015 study by Jean Ducedy and colleagues published in Current Biology examined altruism in children from religious and non-religious families. They found that children from religious households showed less altruistic behavior and more punitive attitudes than children from secular homes. While this study generated significant debate and has methodological limitations, follow-up research by Norenzian in 2016 confirmed certain aspects of these findings while adding more important nuance about different types of religious motivation. Though later research suggested that the effect size might be smaller than initially reported, so while some studies suggest this, the debate is ongoing. A more recent 2022 meta-analysis by Harrison and colleagues in Personality and Social Psychology Review examined 46 studies on religion and moral reasoning. They found that religions emphasizing divine command ethics, something is wrong because God forbids it, correlated with less sophistical moral reasoning than religions emphasizing principle-based ethics, God forbids things that cause harm to others. Consider how this plays out in real-world moral decision-making. Dr. Robert Sapolsky's research on moral emotions at Stanford University demonstrates that people who were taught morality primarily through reward-punishment frameworks showed less activation in brain regions associated with empathy when making moral judgments. Instead, they showed greater activation in areas associated with rule-following and authority processing. The testimonies of those raised in strict religious environments further illustrate the issue. In a 2023 qualitative study by Morrison on moral development after leaving religion, former believers frequently described having to rebuild their moral compass as adults. One participant explained, quote, "I had to learn how to make ethical decisions based on how my actions affected others, not on whether God would punish me. It was like learning to walk again morally," end quote. Again, it's crucial to acknowledge variation among religious traditions. Reform Judaism, progressive Christianity, and certain Buddhist approaches, for example, often emphasize ethical principles and human flourishing over divine commandment ethics. These approaches show fewer negative correlations with moral development in the research literature. The cumulative evidence from psychology, neuroscience, and first-hand accounts suggests that certain forms of religious indoctrination can potentially harm children's intellectual, psychological, and moral development. These harms appear most pronounced when religion is taught as unquestionable truth, when fear is used as a motivator, and when normal human development is pathologized through religious frameworks. These findings don't suggest that all religious education is harmful, but they do raise serious ethical questions about how religious beliefs are transmitted to children. As developmental psychologist Dr. Janet Helms notes, the key distinction appears to be between teaching children what to think versus how to think about existential questions. After examining the ethical concerns and potential harms of religious indoctrination, let me turn to a constructive alternative. What would an ethical approach to children's religious and philosophical education look like? The core distinction we've established earlier provides our foundation. Teaching exposes children to multiple perspectives and encourages critical thinking, while indoctrination demands belief without scrutiny. Dr. Robert Nash of the University of Vermont, in his book Faith, Hype, and Clarity, Teaching About Religion in American Schools and Colleges, argues that ethical religious education should facilitate understanding rather than conversion. First and foremost, children benefit from exposure to multiple belief systems, not just one their family happens to hold. Dr. Robert Jackson's interpretive approach to religious education, widely adopted in European education systems, advocates teaching about various world religions, indigenous spiritual traditions, and secular philosophical frameworks as equally worthy of study. A 2019 longitudinal study by Kurz and Nauf, published in Religion and Education, found that students exposed to this comparative approach demonstrated greater religious literacy, more nuanced thinking about existential questions, and reduced religious prejudice compared to those who received single tradition religious instruction. This doesn't mean parents can't share their own beliefs. Dr. David Shinos' research on child spirituality, published in the International Journal of Children's Spirituality, demonstrates that children benefit when adults honestly share their personal convictions while distinguishing clearly between "this is what I believe" and "this is what you must believe." The former respects a child's developing autonomy, the latter undermines it. Some religious parents understandably worry that this approach might contradict their conviction that their religious claims are objectively true, not merely personally meaningful. Dr. John Hawley, himself a religious educator, addresses this concern in his 2020 work, Faith Formation in the Secular Age. Parents can maintain their belief in objective religious truth while still respecting their child's developing capacity to evaluate these claims. A confident faith trusts that truth will be recognized as such when encountered by an open mind. Secondly, children should be actively encouraged to question and think critically about religious and philosophical claims. Dr. Marcia Bunge, director of the Child in Religious and Ethics Project, argues in her research that critical thinking about faith benefits rather than threatens genuine religious development. Her interviews with religious educators across traditions found that those who encouraged questioning reported deeper, more resilient faith commitments among young people compared to those who discouraged doubts. Dr. Perry Glanzer's 2021 study on faith development in adolescence found that young people who were encouraged to question within religious context were more likely to maintain religious commitment into adulthood compared to those who experienced doubt as forbidden. Questions like, how do we know God exists? Or why do different religions say different things? Should be met with thoughtful discussion, not evasion or warnings. A concrete example of this approach comes from progressive Jewish education. The traditional practice of Shavutra involves pairs of students vigorously debating different interpretations of sacred text. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, while maintaining Orthodox Jewish conviction, advocated this approach. The highest form of religious education is not indoctrination, but the teaching of critical reflection and respectful argument. Third, ethical education teaches moral reasoning independent of religious doctrine. While religion contains valuable moral insights, Dr. Larry Nucci's research on moral development at University of California found that children benefit from learning to evaluate ethical questions based on principles like harm reduction, fairness, and respect for autonomy, even as they learn tradition-specific moral teachings. This approach to ethics, associated with philosophers like Peter Singer and Martha Nussbaum, equips children to make moral judgments even as their metaphysical beliefs may evolve. Dr. William Damon's longitudinal studies on moral development at Stanford University demonstrate that children who develop principle-based ethical reasoning show greater moral resilience when facing complex ethical dilemmas compared to those whose morality remains solely tied to authority or tradition. A 2022 meta-analysis by Klein and colleagues in Developmental Psychology examined 87 studies on moral education approaches. They found that programs teaching ethical principles rather than rule following produce better outcomes across measures of moral reasoning, pro-social behavior, and ethical decision-making. Several educational systems demonstrate that this balanced approach is both practical and effective. Finland, consistently ranking among the world's best educational systems, provides a research-based example. According to Dr. Arto Kallioiniemi's comprehensive analysis of Finnish religious education published in Religious Education, Finnish schools teach about multiple religions from an academic perspective, focusing on understanding different traditions rather than promoting any particular one. The Religious Education Council of England and Wales has developed another evidence-based model. Their framework, supported by both religious and secular organizations, emphasizes learning about religion and learning from religion, understanding diverse traditions while developing personal responses to existential questions. A 2021 evaluation by the Office for Standards in Education found that this approach led to greater religious literacy, reduced prejudice, and enhanced critical thinking skills. Even in more traditional contexts, there are models of respectable religious education. Dr. Bo-Young Lee's research on Korean American Christian education found successful examples where children were taught their tradition's beliefs while being encouraged to ask questions and compare perspectives with other worldviews. Parents maintain their conviction in Christianity's truth while creating space for children's developing autonomy. So what might this look like in practice? Here are some concrete examples. Instead of saying, God created the world, a parent might say, our family believes God created the world. Other people believe the universe began with the Big Bang, and some believe both are true in different ways. When a child asks difficult questions like, how do we know heaven exists? An ethical response acknowledges uncertainty. That's a great question. Our religious tradition teaches about heaven, but no one can prove it scientifically. People have different beliefs about what happens after death. When discussing morality, parents might say, our religious tradition teaches this action is wrong, and I agree. The main reason it's wrong is that it hurts other people. Even people with different religious beliefs usually agree about this because they also care about not harming others. The approach I'm advocating for doesn't require parents to abandon their religious traditions. Rather, it asks that they present those traditions in ways that respect the children's right to intellectual freedom. As Dr. David Elkin, a pioneering researcher in child development, notes, the goal is not to raise children without religion, but to raise children who can engage with religion thoughtfully rather than fearfully. By emphasizing teaching over indoctrination, we can honor the richness of human spiritual and philosophical thought while respecting children's developing autonomy. We can share cultural and religious traditions while still respecting each child's right to reach their own conclusions about life's deepest questions. So throughout this whole examination, we've confronted an uncomfortable truth. Religious indoctrination, the practice of imposing comprehensive religious worldviews on children before they can critically evaluate them, violates children's intellectual autonomy in profound, lasting ways. As we've seen throughout the research of Paget, Bloom, and others, children's cognitive architecture simply isn't developed enough to evaluate metaphysical claims independently. Their natural trust in authority figures, combined with developmental limitations in abstract reasoning, creates conditions where beliefs instilled during childhood can become resistant to later critical examination. When we declare a 4-year-old as a Christian child or a Muslim child, we're not describing their considered position, but rather our imposition upon them. The documented consequences are concerning. Studies by Winnell, Ramirez, and others reveal how fear-based doctrines can create lasting psychological harm. Research by Colesberg and DeCidi demonstrates how moral development can be impaired while based solely on divine command rather than ethical principles. Most significantly, the work of Anderson and Hill shows how critical thinking itself can be compromised when children are taught that questioning certain beliefs is forbidden or dangerous. As I've shown, not all religious education constitutes indoctrination. Progressive approaches within many faith traditions encourages questions, presents multiple perspectives, and respect children's developing autonomy. The key distinction, as developmental psychologist Dr. Janet Helms noted, lies between teaching children what to think versus teaching how to think about existential questions. An ethical alternative exists. The evidence-based models from Finland, England, and Wales demonstrate that children can learn about religious traditions while developing their own capacity for critical evaluation. They can inherit rich cultural and spiritual heritage without having metaphysical commitments imposed on them before they can meaningfully consent. Society must now challenge the normalization of religious indoctrination. This requires distinguishing between teaching about religion, which respects children's autonomy, and indoctrinating into religion, which exploits their cognitive vulnerability. Schools, religious institutions, and families alike must prioritize approaches that equip children with tools to think for themselves rather than dictating what to believe. Now, to be clear, this isn't about eliminating religion from children's lives. It's about presenting religious and philosophical ideas in ways that honor children's developmental journeys towards intellectual autonomy. When faith traditions are confident in their truth, they have nothing to fear from encouraging questions and critical thought. Our collective responsibility is clear. Create educational environments that nurture critical thinking, respect intellectual freedom, and prepare children to navigate life's deepest questions with both open minds and strong moral foundations. By doing so, we honor not only the children's rights, but also the authentic pursuit of truth that lies at the heart of genuine spiritual and philosophical inquiry. And that's it for the talk today. So what do you think? Do you think that there are plenty of issues with childhood indoctrination? Or do you think there are plenty of good reasons to indoctrinate? Let me know in the comments below. Now, if you like these educational videos, hit that like button to encourage more nuanced academic lessons. Now, if you'd like to see more of a bunch of topics like this, hit that subscribe if you haven't already to have more delivered directly to you. And speaking of special delivery, I need to deliver a special thanks to my patrons, especially Calamitous Anima and Sora, but the rest of you are first-class mail in my heart. If you'd like to be free shipping, you can join them for as low as $1 a month at patreon.com/darkaballtrades. Now, I really love doing these kinds of lessons on one specific topic. It allows me to really keep my thoughts organized. Thank you to all of you in the live chat, in the comments, who like and subscribe, and especially share my videos on your social media or just with a friend. All of those are great ways to support my channel for no financial cost. But really, I appreciate every single one of you. Thank you for taking time and being here with me today. And as always, keep learning.